Hello everyone. This week we are going to take a look at correlation and how to do correlation in JASP. There's a file actually in the data library that I want to use. I'll probably have to explain a little bit about it, but let me go ahead and open it up. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my file. So go to open. I will go to the data library. And ironically, well, maybe not so ironically, when we learn about regression, we'll probably understand better, but the file that I want is under regression, but we're going to use it for correlation. So the one I want to look at is called the Big Five Personality Traits. Let me just go ahead and open that file. And we have in this file 5 columns, 5 variables that we are tracking. Now, if you're not familiar with the Big Five Personality Traits, they were originally developed in 1949. They have been revised over the years. They've been around forever. And basically what they are is there are tests that will measure the degree that each person kind of falls in these 5 areas. 4 of them are fairly positive in the way that they're tracked. One of them is kind of not so positive. But let me go through each one of these, and I'm actually going to start with extraversion. Extraversion is the extent to which somebody is outgoing, the extent to which somebody takes great energy from being around other people, just really kind of outgoing, bubbly, kind of social people. And if you're really strong on the extroversion scale, you'll have a high score. If you're not strong on the extroversion scale, tend to be more quiet, more introverted, kept to yourself, kind of would rather not be around people, then you're going to have a lower score on this scale. The next one is openness, and openness kind of gauges the extent to which a person is open to new experiences. They may order strange food at a restaurant. They may want to travel a lot. They may want to experience new stuff. They're not really a slave to routine. The opposite of that, and so those folks would get higher scores. The opposite of that is somebody who is actually really comfortable with routine and doesn't like to deviate from kind of doing the same thing in the same way every day. Somebody who is a little bit more closed and not really open to new experiences. The next category is agreeableness, and it's kind of as it sounds. Somebody who is agreeable is somebody who is willing to help others. Very kind of their first thought in their mind when interacting with groups is how can they help others? So there's a great deal of sort of kind of that drive to be of service to others or be charitable or be outgoing. And it kind of goes with the extroversion and openness, but this one's really more focused on how I consider others first before I consider myself. I'm agreeable. I'm nice to be around, that kind of thing. A high score would be somebody who would be that outgoing, agreeable person who's thinking of others first, kind of very social. And a lower score would be somebody who's a little less strong on in those areas. Conscientiousness measures the extent to which somebody is basically a planner. Somebody is very conscientious. They plan, they anticipate, they structure. Everything is very organized. Everything is very kind of under control. And the opposite of that is not that they're not conscientious. It's just that they're less so, both with agreeableness and conscientiousness. They're just less if they're not strong in those areas, they will get the lower scores. Okay, so like I said, those first 4 are fairly kind of focused on positive. The higher the score, the more positive, the more conscientious, more agreeable, more open, more extroverted, with the higher scores. Neuroticism is the extent to which somebody is maybe less emotionally intelligent, tends to get upset, has anxiety, and that really drives personality in the sense that if somebody doesn't want to be anxious, they don't want to get upset about something, they may avoid situations where those, what's going on in that particular situation could cause them to feel anxious or sad or whatever. So neuroticism is really kind of focused more on negative. The higher the score, the more kind of negative, the more neurotic a person is. Whereas on the other ones, the higher the score, the more extroverted, open, agreeable, or conscientious that person is. Okay. Now that having been said, we would like to know if these 5 personality traits, if there are any correlations between them. Now, in the announcement, I talked a little bit about correlation. Correlations measure the degree to which 2 variables vary in a similar way. In other words, how much variance is there in this particular column, and how much variance is there in this particular column, and do they vary in a similar way, or do they vary in an opposite way? Okay, so if in most cases where neuroticism goes up, extroversion also goes up, then that's probably going to result in a positive correlation. Correlations rank between -1 and 1. So that's going to probably result in a positive correlation, and the closer to 1, the stronger the correlation. If, as probably is the case, the higher on the neuroticism scale, the lower on the extroversion scale, then that could result in a negative correlation, something that's getting close to -1, which just basically means when one variable goes up, it's fairly common that the other variable will go down. So we're going to take a look at these correlations, and then we're going to look at what the results are and see what it means. So just like the data file we got was under regression, so is correlation. So we're going to grab correlation, and it's going to take our 5 fields, our 5 variables, and it's going to pop them over here in correlation. And we can one by one move them out over to the variables. Over here's our table with nothing in it because we haven't selected anything yet. So we're going to start with neuroticism, move it over there. And we can't really do a correlation if there's only one variable. So we need another variable, at least one other variable. Now you can either select the variable and hit the arrow, you can drag it over, or you can double click. And it'll put them all over there. Now look what it's given us. We have a neuroticism versus neuroticism where we can't do a variable against itself, so we've got blanks where in all those situations where we'd be comparing the variable against itself. But we can do neuroticism versus extroversion. We're using Pearson's R, which is Pearson's correlation, and that is the most common correlation tool that we'll use, so we're just going to stick with it. We see that we have a -0.35 correlation. That's approaching moderately negative correlation. So just as we expected, when somebody's level of neuroticism increases, they probably have a lower level of extroversion. In other words, they're more introverted. Let's take a look at neuroticism versus openness. This one is giving us a really small correlation. So 0.010 is the correlation. That's pretty close to 0. And what that seems to suggest is that there's really no relationship between neuroticism and openness. That there's just no consistent pairing of that. Agreeableness has a -0.134 correlation and with neuroticism, and then conscientiousness has a -3.68 correlation. The other thing that it's given us is it's given us p-values. So we've talked about p-values already. P-values are the extent to which we have enough data and we have enough information that the result that we're getting from this particular comparison is something that we trust, something that we believe is beyond chance. So for extroversion, our p-value is less than 0.001, which is great. That means we can trust that result. But our p-value for our neuroticism and openness, remember, it generated an almost 0 correlation, but it generated a p-value of 0.817, which basically means it's not very reliable at all. There's not any real significance there. For agreeableness, we also got a negative correlation. It's a fairly small-ish negative correlation, but the p-value looks pretty good, 0.003, which is well below 0.05. And then conscientiousness, we got a negative correlation, approaching moderate negative correlation, and we have a p-value of less than 0 or 0.001. So we can trust that as well. And then we can look over here and see the other comparisons. Our highest correlation that we get, we have the highest correlation, the strongest correlation that we get, it happens to be negative, but the strongest correlation we get in the entire group is conscientiousness versus neuroticism. Okay? Just like there is in every other screen in JASP, there's a whole bunch of other options. And we can change our view to show these pairwise in this view if we want. That's just another different way of looking at it. Might be a preferred way. Or we can look at it kind of in this table. There's other things we could look at. Our alternate hypothesis is that these are correlated, and so that's what we're basing our p-value on. And the And we'll just leave it at that. But we could also say correlated positively or correlated negatively, and then we just focus on the positive or the negative correlations by themselves. There's plots also. I'm not going to go into the assumption checks or the options because there's not really anything there that I really want to pursue. But I do want to take a look at the plots. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the scatter plots. And the nice thing about this is it scatter plots every pair for us. So we can look at, now neuroticism can't be compared to itself, but neuroticism can be compared to extraversion. And just like we saw in the values, we have a negative 0.350 correlation. Our line is going down to the right. Okay, that is indicative in a scatter plot of a negative correlation. Our neuroticism compared to openness was pretty close to 0, so that's going to give us pretty much a parallel line, a flat line. And our agreeableness compared to neuroticism was pretty small, but it's still a negative correlation. And then our biggest negative correlation was neuroticism compared to conscientiousness. That has a correlation of 0.368 to the negative, and that is very visible in our plot. We can see that in our plot. Then we can look at all the others, just same as we have up here. It will give us all of the other comparisons. What it doesn't give us here, and we could probably turn it on, I think if we turn on statistics, it'll tell us. What we don't get is we don't get the p-values. Now, if we turn on statistics, it's only going to give us the actual R, the correlation coefficient. It doesn't give us the p-values, but we've got the p-values up here, so that's fine. So anyway, that is how we can take a group of fields and we can put them into JASP, and we can calculate the correlation coefficients and see the confidence with which we can believe those correlation coefficients based on the data that we have put in. Your assignment this week, I will provide you with a file, and your assignment this week is to basically do exactly this. And then I want you to produce the plots. I want you to put everything into a document, and I want you to explain to me what it means. Okay? If you have any questions, let your instructor know.